This is a brief history of Iberian varietals and their wines both in Europe and California. It's actually a personal view. The history of Iberian varietals, I will use the term to mean both countries on the peninsula and California, is mixed. Some Iberian wines made with specific varietals have been known for centuries. It is varietal interest which has been, and in some instances is still lacking. It is probably after the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and the French domination in Spain and Portugal that there was greater interest in wines from these countries. It definitely takes place in the post-Ovidium and phylloxera periods of the 19th century. In fact, if it were not for the lucrative French market for Bordeaux wines during the phylloxera problems in France, and areas such as Rioja would probably never have developed. Consumers, and especially wine merchants, needed certain styles, and the Rioja area of northern Spain filled this void. Like the present, there was as much criticism as there was boosterism. A case in point. James Forrester, who was to become a noted port producer, a noble of Portugal, and cartographer of the Douro, arrived in Portugal from England in 1830. In an essay written in 1853, he states, "There is not a quality or type of wine that is not possible to produce in Portugal. Wines, which when pure, are well able to compete with the best vintages of Lafite, Margaux, Beaune, and Chambertin." Take that, France. Looking through the varied and colorful history of Iberian wines, there's little written about grapes other than they produce wine from a specific location. It is the appellation before the concept existed that was important. For example, Jerez de la Frontera was famous for its wine, sherry, before the informing grape variety, Palomino, became famous. The question is, which came first? The variety producing a very good wine in a specific area, or wine made in such a way that it became famous because it corresponded to market necessities? During this very intensive day, we'll probably hear more about Iberian varieties and their characteristics than we want to. Since we have real experts to listen to, I'll try not to bore you too much. But I would like to give you a little of my experiences with Iberian wines and their varieties. I'm a wine merchant. As such, I travel to find new wines, and, if I like them, bring them to my customers to buy. It used to be an easier job 30 years ago than now. There were fewer really good wines around. I must admit also that my commercial interest was not in Iberian table wines, but port, sherry, and Madeira. For this reason, I used to visit both Porto and Jerez at least every year. But not for table wines, for fortified wines. Of course, the table wines would appear at meals. The most interesting of them also reached Sacramento. I remember my amazement when in Jerez in 1989, I was shown a white table wine produced from Palomino that was very good, clean and fresh, but it was not floor sherry. Today, this typology, the white wine from Palomino, is a much marketable item, whereas Fino sherry is not. In California, we should also be conscious of the fact that Spain gave us viticulture and our first variety, Mission, now known to be Listan Prieto. At one point, it was our major varietal. If for no other reason than its being the first varietal in California, the variety should be kept as a living memorial to our historical past. I spent my junior year of college in Madrid in 1962-63, burnishing my Spanish. It was a time also to learn firsthand about both wine and food there. A lot of changes have taken place. In fact, 40 years ago, there were far fewer famous Spanish wines and even fewer Portuguese. In Portugal, however, even then, there were wines that were once famous and were becoming extinct. Jancis Robinson, in her first book, the wine book in 1979, states, Spain and Portugal make wines from mixtures of mainly local varieties. Specific grape varieties do not get to play an important part in Spanish winemaking. Wines tend to be made from a great mixture of local grape varieties, which are all vinified together. So much for varietal interest. On my first trip to Portugal in 1970, I saw firsthand the effect that in a vast wine-producing country, there were wines unknown in one part of the country to knowledgeable tasters in another. I wanted to look for some of the more famous table wines of Portugal when the Real Vinícola, the old royal port wine company of Porto, had the majority under its control. Prices for French, German, and California wines had risen, and I needed to find some good substitutes. I remember very well my meeting with Rui Brito y Cunha, then manager of the Real Vinícola. I found some very nice down wines, down cabido, vintages 50, 55, and then the youngest that they were offering was 1965. Can you imagine a 5-year-old wine just being offered? We bought the wines and they sold well. Their highest price was $1.99 a bottle. Knowing that I was looking for table wines, Mr. Brito showed me a label of a wine he had just tasted while on a trip to the south of Portugal. It was the Reguengos de Monsaraz of José de Sousa Rosado Fernandes, called Tinto Velho, Old Red. This estate, founded in 1878, made wine in potes or talhas de barro, large amphora-like pottery urns. Brito y Cunha had never heard of the wine before and remarked to me about this, saying that it was a very good wine, but he was astonished never to have tasted it previously. So struck by it, he had the label taken off the bottle. Hearing of my interest, he presented it to me. The property is now owned by the Swedish Franco brothers, who are Davis alumni. Another wine, Gaeiras, owned by old Senor Pinto Basto near Óbidos, was a property I visited both in 1970 and 1974. Mr. Pinto Basto's estate is no longer. His house on the estate had been Wellington's campaign headquarters during the Peninsular War. On my visits, he was very pleased to tell me that his white Gaeiras, produced from the Vital variety, had been very highly praised by Maynard Amorim. Even Pinto Basto didn't like his red wine, but the white was fresh, pale, clean, with a savory mineral flavor and long-lived. Its striking dark blue label was highly distinctive. After a sabbatical visit, Amorim praised the wine since it was one of the few fresh, clean whites he had tasted in Portugal. The white Gaeiras was fermented and aged in enormous Brazilian mahogany tanks that were old. Otherwise, the wine picked up strange flavors and smells from the mahogany, according to Pinto Basto. He remarked that the tanks needed little topping since the wood grain was so tight. Another wine that I first became acquainted with in 1970 was the Alvarinho-based Vinho Verde called Deu Ladeu, produced by the cooperative cellar in Monção. It was then the most sought-after white wine in Portugal, found almost exclusively on restaurant wine lists. There are other famous producers of Alvarinho in Portugal, but it is curious that this variety entered California and the U.S. under its Spanish name, Albarino. I think one of the problems with Portuguese varieties and Spanish varieties is also the way they're spelled. We don't like lots of H's in our names. In her April 24th, 25th, 2009 Financial Times wine column, Jancis Robinson details the none too unusual story of mistaken varietal identity and recounts the recent Australian problem with what the Government Research Centre, CSIRO, had imported as Albarino, now actually known to be Sauvignon, a French variety from the Jura. So much for good faith in varietal collections. On the other hand, since the variety was well accepted by the Australian consumer under its mistaken identity, a case could be made for it now to create another fad with an even more obscure variety. Most of the time, it's just a question of marketing. There are several Portuguese wines that probably owe more to location than anything. The practically now non-existent wines grown close to Lisbon and which made Portuguese wine famous in the 18th and 19th centuries, Colares, Carcavelos, and Bucelas, may be soon merely historical footnotes. Close to Lisbon, these areas are now rapidly succumbing to housing and other development. The expansion of the Lisbon airport will probably end the history of Bucelas, but not Arinto, its predominant variety. Arinto would work very well in California. Carcavelos once famed as Lisbon wine and sent to the Chinese emperor in 1752 by the king, Don José I, is no longer commercially produced. A fortified wine produced from Galego Dorado, it was the delight of the English market after the Napoleonic Wars, as attested by the number of bottle tickets, those are little silver things that you put on decanters, bearing its name and all sorts of variants to it. Originally, it was the property of the Marquês de Pombal, the royal minister who demarcated the Douro district. Its ownership alone would have made the wine famous. That it was good made it notorious. Sadly, Galego Dorado is practically extinct. The last Carcavelos I drank some years ago in Lisbon from the Quinta do Barão was scented, warm and rich, yet not cloying. In a work titled Travels in Portugal through the provinces of Entre Douro Minho, Beira, Extremadura, and Alentejo in the years 1789-1790, written by James Murphy, an Irish architect from Dublin, published in London in 1795, Murphy writes about Carcavelos. Of the peculiarity of the soil about this district, Calcavella produces a striking instance, where there is a vineyard of no considerable extent, so a small vineyard, that yields grapes different from those of any part of the kingdom. Its wine is well known all over Europe, but I believe its name is better known in general than its flavor, for it is not possible that so limited a spot can yield one half of the wine sold in London alone under the denomination of Carcavella or Calcavella, as it is improperly called. Fakery will always be with us. Colares, now famous as a viticultural area, is described by Murphy. A fine valley called Colares extends between this and the village of Sintra. It may be called the Golden Vale of Portugal, for it is one of the richest and best cultivated spots in the kingdom. The greater part is planted with fruit trees, particularly oranges. Remishko, the ungrafted informing variety of Colares, is grown in 15-foot deep trenches on sandy soil overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Murphy does not mention the Colares, and it may not have been famous in the late 18th century. Remember, this is almost 80 years before any catastrophic viticultural problems would hit Europe. When I first saw this viticultural area in 1970, small vineyard parcels were protected from the Atlantic salt spray by woven bamboo fences, and the vines grown directly on the ground had V-notched props to hold up the individual clusters off the ground. The Remishko cuttings were planted in trenches deep enough to reach clay, and then as the vine grew out of the trench, it would be filled in with sand until the vine reached ground level. I finished my last bottle of the 1963 and 2008 with Rupert Symington, the port shipper. Needing a great deal of age to be really drinkable, this Colares was still a beautiful, lively crimson color, no browning, with a characteristic cranberry-like aroma and still tannic, with a tart, savory flavor. When it came to classifying Portuguese varieties in California, they were classified as to their classic type, Port or Madeira, never as table wine varieties. Charles Wetmore's 1884 ampelography lists only a few. Verdelho, par excellence the finest Madeira variety. Trousseau, Bastardo, he said was destined to become widely planted. Hilgard's report of viticultural work, 1887-1889, cites the port-type varieties then being tried: Bastardo, Trousseau, Alvarelhão, Tinta Amarela, Morisco Preto, Tinta Cal, and Tinta da Madeira. Just as an historical note, it might interest you to know that the 1887 library of the Board of Viticultural Commissioners, the 1880 legislature created government agency that was charged with promoting, collecting, and disseminating viticultural information on California, consisted of 409 known titles. Of these, 74% were French, 17 English, 4% German, 3% Italian, and exactly 2 books in Portuguese. These were the Segunda Memoria written or published in Lisbon in 1868, by Giulio Maximo, the Visconde de Villamayor, the Relatorio on the Central Commission for Phylloxera Services, 1880-1881, of the Viscount Villar d'Allen, and the 1884 translation of the Villamayor work, which is called The Viniculture of Claret, a treatise on the making, maturing, and keeping of claret wine by Father John Bleasdale, a British Catholic priest who was famous for his viticultural work in both Australia and California. I'm grateful to bibliographer Axel Borg for a copy of his research sleuthing out the works of the Commission Library in Shields Library here at Davis. Note, there are no Spanish works cited. The last work on recommended varieties, California wine grapes, composition and quality of their musts and wines, 1960, a follow-up by Amory and Winkler on their previous 1944 work, recommended Fernão Pires, also known as Maria Gomes, Suzão, Tinta Cal, Tinta Madeira, and Verdelho. Not recommended were Pareira Matias, Pé Agudo, Preto Manteudo, Tinta Mol, Trincadeira. The note on Fernão Pires is very laudatory, but its name was probably a deciding factor not to push it for planting. The other ones were. Never conceived of as table wine varieties by California researchers, these were always classified as port types. On the other hand, table wine in the Douro had not been seen very much since the early days of port production in the 18th century, with the exception of such wines as Evel, Lamego, and Porca de Mursa of the Real Vinícola. It was with the creation of Barca Velha, the first important Douro table wine in 1951, so 60 years ago, that there is the inkling of a renewal. At one point in the mid-70s, most of the British port shippers adamantly refused to make table wine from the Douro, with the exception of the firm of Coburn. Their reasoning: we know how to make port, not table wine. Taylor Fladgate still refuses to be involved in Douro table wine. It is curious that the most important table wine in both Portugal and Australia, Barca Velha and Grange Hermitage, were born in the early 1950s, after a visit to Bordeaux by their respective creators, Fernando Nicolau de Almeida from Ferreira and Max Schubert from Penfolds. I think it is with the use of modern enological technology and grapes from the old and very old vineyards in the Douro and elsewhere in Portugal that exceptional red and white wines can be made. The country truly represents the effect of viticulture over technology. In the Douro, without a doubt, quality wine is made in the vineyard. But perhaps the same thing could be said of any good viticulture area. In this respect, the first major English language book on the world's wines, a treatise on the origins, nature, and varieties of wines, published in London in 1872 by Doctors Thudicum and Dupré, remarked thus about the Douro. The vines of the Alto Douro differ in specific botanical character from all other vines, as port wine differs from other wines. In California, there was a spike in interest in Portuguese varieties in the late 1970s and early 80s, with Andy Quaddy asking Harold Olmo to import the classic port varieties for Quaddy's port-type wine production. This Olmo did. The varieties were planted in Amador County first, then elsewhere. I think the first table wine made in California from Douro varieties was produced by the late Tim Spencer, whose winery was then in Stockton. I remember Tim coming to me with a sample of his table wine produced from 3 port varieties, and I said to him I had a name for it, Tres Cachos. He asked what it meant. I said 3 clusters. This comes from the port trade's traditional lodge markings of pipes, with a stylized grape cluster on the pipe head. The higher the quality, the more clusters. If you want to see this as a label, take a look at the Graham's 6 grapes Ruby Port. In California, we have had varietally named port-style wines on the market for some time. One, Paul Masson's Suzão Tawny Port, was created in the late 1960s to be competition for the venerable Tinta Madeira wine produced by the Ficklins in Madeira. Interestingly, it was this Susano port that was poured for me in a blind tasting in 1982 by Jeremy Zeno, then manager of the Madeira Wine Association in Funchal, and it was not so different from a medium-rich Madeira. Baga, the major red variety in the Bairrada, was tried by the late actor Raymond Burr at his vineyard in Sonoma County. Burr was interested in Portuguese varieties since a former wife was Portuguese and he had experienced a lot of wines in Portugal. We spoke often about this project, but with his death I have not heard further about it. Doubtless Portuguese varieties can do well in California, but I believe a number of wines produced by these varieties in their home really are acclimatized to there and certainly now produce excellent wines that are worth searching out. The experience of drinking a good vinho verde is a case in point. It is a wine style we cannot produce easily in California, but eminently worth seeking out from Portugal. As a note to this, Ian J. Gallo once sold a vinho verde type wine called Polo Brindisi. Remember what was the end of the name? Polo Brindisi. It's so easy. Crackling, low in alcohol, and unusual for California, it had a certain market sector. I sent a note to Ernest Gallo about it, complimenting him on the achievement, and he was not pleased. It was not meant to be like Vinho Verde. But wines like Mateus Rosé, Lancer's Crackling Rosé, created demand for Portuguese wines and for this wine style. Whether intended or not, they also created a typology, crackling. How many of us make crackling wines anymore? These were wines that sold well for a time, then slowly drifted into oblivion for the American market. Currently, both Lancers and Mateus are back on the market and are much improved. All said and done, Portugal's patrimony of old plantings and autochthonous varieties is being preserved and made more widely known. It would be a shame for Portugal to lose its way in today's forest of Syrah, Cabernet, and Merlot. Now that we are beyond the Lancers and Mateus era, Portugal can really surprise us. With Spain, we are much indebted to that country since it is our history in California. The first vines imported were mainly rustic ones like Mission. They produced a crop without too much trouble and did it abundantly. A missionary and frontier agriculture would probably not have needed the niceties of delicate, high-quality varieties, or at least not in the beginning. And the Spanish producers would have been very put out if there was no export market. Hilgard, with a concise yet not condescending tone, remarks in his report of viticultural work 1887-1889, published in 1892, that the products and meteorological records of California show beyond all possible denial that by far the larger portion of the cultivatable area, California's climate, corresponds most nearly to that of the countries immediately bordering the Mediterranean. Where the orange and olive grow alongside of the grape, the rational conclusion must be that the character of the latter will be essentially similar to that of the corresponding parts of the Old World, and that the experience and practice of Spain and Portugal, Mediterranean France, Italy, Algeria, and Greece, and not that of the Rhine or the Atlantic seaboard of France, is presumably applicable to our wines. In the report of work of the Agricultural Experiment Station for 1890, published in 1891, there is a bulletin note written by Louis Paparelli, one of Hilgard's assistants, regarding Italian varieties, which I will cite here due to its relevance to Spanish ones. If it is asked what the special value of this class of wines, the Italian but intercalate Spanish, the answer is that good dry wine which keeps well cannot be expected under conditions of greater heat when northern grapes are cultivated. Both Italy and Spain make dry wines. The warm parts of California must depend more upon the Spanish and Italian varieties. These varieties, and also the Persian, are intended for the dry interior valleys, the warmer foothills, and the southern counties. It's little known, but 12 Persian varieties were imported into California and trialed by the university. Two varieties, Mataro and Grenache, are particularly singled out. Of Mataro, Hilgard says, this variety is of Spanish origin, but actually is the one mostly cultivated in southern France. Mataro is a good bearer and stands heat well. The Mataro should be classed after the Pinots, the Cabernets, and the Malbec. Its product is far ahead of that of the Morastel. Goes on to say, Grenache is pretty well known in the state. It is a variety belonging to northern Spain and southern France. My experience, just a sentence, one time speaking with John Parducci at a tasting where we were on the same panel, we were tasting wines called Mourvedre, and John says, why hell, we wouldn't pay $50 a ton to crush Mataro. So much for the reputation of Mataro. My experience with Spanish wines in 1962 have several highlights, some good, others not so good, others still a footnote on Spanish wine history. The oldest Rioja I tasted at that time was the 1905 vintage in a half bottle from the Bodega La Rioja Alta. This was to become a label for this producer, still called Reserva 905. It sold for 5 pesetas, about 5 cents then, the bottle at the bodega. I drank it on Thanksgiving Day 1962, and I hope I remember it for its quality rather than its price, since Spain had this quaint rule that wines could not be marked up from their original price. It was scented, fresh, with a clarity tone that showed why the French descended on Rioja after phylloxera. It was delicious. The very first fancy Spanish wine I drank that year was a Vega Sicilia Único, 1931. It was at a famous restaurant in the Plaza Mayor in Madrid. I knew nothing about the wine, but it was the most expensive wine on the list, but in dollars it cost almost nothing. So I ordered it. When it was decanted and poured, I smelled the glass and said, "It's acetic." The laconic answer from the sommelier was, "They all are." In fact, in my experience, the wines from this estate have all had the same familial character. What are now some of the darlings of the Spanish wine world? Wines like Cigales, a rosé sold in our local Tasca on Calle Jorge Juan, where I lived, was what we quaffed with baby lamb chops. It was the house wine with high alcohol, over 14%, if I recall correctly. Other Tascas offered the Tinto de Toro, known at that time by the down-market nickname of Tintoro. It was an inky, black, high-alcohol wine sold very young in Madrid for the delight of the workers who came from the area of Valladolid. The Tasca wines, that's what these little bars were called, have now become important wines for Spain due to enological work improving quality. The most prestigious white wine in Spain at the time was Alelia Legítimo. It provoked much laughter among us young Americans since it was proudly labeled legitimate. A very small appellation right on the Franco-Spanish border, the wine is made out of the curiously named Panza Blanca or Parchet variety. Marqués de Riscal, 1906 and 1910, we drank for lunch on the 8th of December that year with spit-roasted pheasant. Again, the wines showed that remarkable old claret character. These old wines, and even older sherries, were all available then from stores very commonly in Madrid. In 1980, I went in search for the Catalan Vi Ranci, produced in the Priorato. I traveled with a friend, Jaume Ciurana, then from the Ministry of Agriculture, to visit the Marqués de Müller Bodega in Tarragona. Vi Ranci are the aged, naturally high alcohol wines made from the grapes grown in the Priorato and the wine aged in the Priorato by letting the ancient vine Garnacha and Cariñena wines simply oxidize in cask. These were the high-class wines of the region. In 1982, back again in the Priorato, I bought our first table wine. In fact, it was the only table wine. It was a 1980 vintage red, only 13% alcohol from Scala Dei, then the newest winery in Grataljobs. The wine was the first cool fermented stainless steel wine of the area, produced in a cellar carved out of the ruins of the Carthusian priory of Scala Dei, from which the area takes its name. The owner was a pharmacist in Barcelona. The wine was very different from anything I had tasted up to then. It was good, and I bought it also because it was the first wine I had seen labeled in Catalan. This was only 7 years after the accession of King Juan Carlos, and Catalan was again permitted to be used as a written language. However, Spain has not always been fortunate in Europe with its wines. Some, yes, especially Sherry Sac, which had been a British delight since the 1400s. Otherwise, like the Fondillon from Alicante made out of Mourvedre, or the Dorado from Rueda, were high alcohol Swedish wines that kept well and were found on royal tables. What is most telling about wines is their contemporary accounts of what they were like. But who would have written these? It was, then as now, the purview of writers who wrote what noted personages thought of wines. In most instances, these comments would come from accounts of what was drunk, what they liked, did not like, and its rarity. One of the first such commentaries in Europe is that of Sant'Elancerio, in a letter written to Cardinal Guido Ascanio Sforza, grandson of Pope Paul III, written after the Pope's death in 1549, so probably written about 1559. This is considered the incunable of Italian wine literature. It contains, quote, useful information for doctors, and of course for Cardinal Sforza. It describes the quality and goodness of wines enjoyed by the Pope and Sant'Elancerio's comments. Regarding the wine of Spain, it is brought sometimes to Rome when a ship from Spain would dock at Civitavecchia, and then the wine is transported by boat to the Ripa, the Rome docks on the Tiber. But this is rare. This wine is heady and strong, and I believe a lot of Spaniards drink water so as not to ruin their stomachs with this wine. These wines are red and very well colored, and to make them lighter, they use a great deal of plaster, calcium sulfate or gypsum, in them, and thus it becomes somewhat lighter and pretty. But this is deleterious for the stomach and the body. The whites are scarce and somewhat lesser. Nonetheless, they are not wine for gentlemen, but for the household, for the servants, and should be well watered, remembering their bigness. It is said by many Spaniards that they keep for 100 years in certain very large clay pots kept buried in the ground. If so, they are wines best left to the Spaniards to drink. Of these wines, His Holiness never wanted to drink them ever. Andrea Bacci, physician to Pope Sixtus V, wrote De Vinorum Naturalis Historia, printed in 1596, and dedicated to another cardinal from one of Rome's most famous families. It is the history of wines of Italy, including those known to the ancients, together with the beers, the wines of France, Spain, and all of Europe then known. All of this in one volume of 7 books. Bacci writes, Spain, Andalusia, Granada, and Extremadura is very fertile with oil, wines, excellent honey, sugar, and different plants which produce all those things necessary for life. Citrus trees produce a prodigious amount of fruit with ever-blooming flowers and abundant fruits. He is strangely silent on the other parts of the country. Before speaking of the wines, he cites a variety of vines. Alvile, this work was written, as I said, because of its name, it was written in Latin, and has only been translated from Latin into Italian. It has never been translated into English. Alvile, is that albilio, albarino? The description, looking like the dawn, so obviously the shoots were slightly pink. Also the Torontes, muscats and musk-scented, both white and black varieties. White Castellano, having small clusters, round berries at San Martin, known as a generous, very productive grape. Malvasia, Lagrima white, another Castellano black. Black Polombina, black Aragonese, Eriales, Longares, Colón de Gallo, probably Cojon de Gallo, from cock's testicles, which in French have the very quaint name of calling them rognon du coq, cock's kidneys. About Spanish wines, he cites only one in Córdoba. There is a wine type, not robust, white and scented, called Pero Jiménez. It is from Madronales. Some of the varieties that he describes are probably extinct, but the wine from Córdoba, Montilla, is still made with Pedro Jiménez. He then goes on to describe another pope's vineyard in Rome, the wine of Magliana. A short distance from Rome, it's now part of the city. Quote, it is perfect, the white as the red. This whole area is a vineyard which was ordered planted by Leo X. Leo X was the second son of Lorenzo de Medici. He was also the pope who was involved with the controversy between Luther and another religious order about the selling of indulgences. In this vineyard, there are vines of the most varied types and from many provinces, even some from Spain. It is such that the vineyard cannot but make very good wine, since it is situated on a beautiful site on a lovely hill. His Holiness had the vineyard kept well, and would go there especially in the summer, and drank often of its wine, which during summer is an excellent drink. It is a shame that the vineyard is falling apart. Spain has probably the earliest description of varieties in any language. In the first half of the 13th century, in a book of heroic poetry called the Libro de Alexandre, where the history of a now Christianized Alexander the Great is told, the narrator of the poem goes into a king's garden and describes the grape varieties there. Tardanielas, late ripening ones, Migaruelas, which are early Tempranillas, white and black Alfonsinas, good Calagranas, others Moleyas or Mollejas, soft varieties, and Torontes, Morosa or Amorosa, of which it is said it is good for the lagar, treading floor. It would appear that the variety known in Galicia as Torontes is one of the oldest named varieties in Spain and Portugal. What we don't know is if what we presently have is this same variety. The name appears to have come from the Portuguese Terantej, meaning local, or from the locality spoken of. Herrera's Agricultura General, this was the first real agricultural book printed in Spain, which actually was the source of agronomical information also for the New World. It was written published in 1513, describes the variety Torontes as a white grape with a small berry which is more translucent than any other. An older description says, a type of white grape which has a small berry, translucent and clear, with very thin, tender skin, which allows it to rot easily. It makes a very fragrant wine, soft and clear, which keeps very well. Sorry. There is an aphorism in both Portuguese and Spanish about Torontes. I'll give it to you in the Portuguese one. As uvas de Torontes, nem as comes, nem as des, para vinho Deus as fez. The grapes of Torontes, you don't eat them and you don't give them away. God made them to be made into wine. This saying used to appear on Torontes Madeiras, especially from the 19th century when the variety had become almost extinct. Torontes in Argentina with the same name is clearly not the same variety. Described as being thin-skinned with the wet conditions of Galicia, it would seem that it is not even a variety from there. The question is, where does it come from? In a 1942 article in Wines and Vines, Filippello describes California wine grape varieties. Of Valdepeñas, he says, the origin of the variety is apparently Spanish. Although obscure, it has an intense color and a characteristic bouquet. It should be planted more heavily. This seems atypical for the variety, yet it was an early import of the 1880s as Tinta Valdepeñas. In Valdepeñas itself, the variety is called Cencibel, spelled C-E-N-C-I-B-E-L. It was probably clear to the importers that such a name would never seem appropriate in California. We'd want to buy a grape variety called Sensible. It is due with the improvement of Tempranillo-based wine quality in Spain that California interest has been piqued. Just as with Mataro becoming fashionable as Mourvedre, Valdepeñas had to become Tempranillo. That Valdepeñas was more down market than, say, Rioja was also a consideration. However, Cencibel has roots in Spanish. Its meaning is that of a certain class of small-berried, early maturing grapes with a slightly sweet sour flavor reminiscent of ginger. We do not have our Douro or Ribera del Duero or Rioja yet. California must sell varietal wines made from grapes from those places. With the wines now coming out of both large and small denominations in Spain and Portugal and their novelty on the market, it would seem an appropriate time to introduce these varietals into California. But do we really need to? Is there a market for them? Is there a market for some of the original wines coming from Europe? I would like to think there is. There are a lot of varieties in the world that could do very well in California. But is the American consumer really interested? I really don't know, but I think not. Some varieties will always be a hard sell. There should be a European model and then a rational, slow development in the market that does not overwhelm either the market or consumer. Just consider the development of Chardonnay in California. Usually, brand new wines coming from unknown varieties are sold at high, almost speculative prices. I think this is inviting trouble. It is true unless the quantity produced is small enough to be a niche wine until the variety gets established on the market. We have no use for a lot of Spanish or Portuguese varietals that cost double or more what their originals do. If you want an example of this folly, just contemplate Sangiovese. Thank you very much. Just a word on the wine that you have in front of you. This is a wine made from the variety called Arinto, which is the variety that makes Bucelish. The wine has the appellation of Bucelish. This was one of the most famous white wines in Europe before the 19th century. I think the wine shows exactly what the grape variety can do. I brought it today because we have it, and it's a very good example of the variety. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much.
We do have enough time for questions if anyone would like to ask Mr. Corti some questions.
Pardon me?
Where was this wine grown?
It's Bucelish. The area of Bucelish is very curious because it's right next to the Lisbon airport, and it's the expansion of the airport and the housing around it that's going to do away with the vineyard. It's a vineyard area which sits right on the Tagus River. So where the river comes down, it comes out into the Bay of Lisbon. This is just a little bit further north and to the east. The mitigating factor of the river might in fact be what constitutes the character of this wine. It's very famous in Portugal. At one time, even in the 18th century or 19th century, Thurecum and Dupré, for example, they contradict what was then the origin of Arinto, people said it was Riesling, because it had the same characteristics that Riesling wines did. It had very high acidity. And it doesn't look anything like Riesling at all, but it's a grape variety I think that would really be very interesting. The other grape variety that I talked about, the grape variety from Carcavelos, is very interesting. It's a variety that is very weak and was very famous because it didn't produce a lot. If someone, say, FPMS were that's your old name.
It's okay, it's okay.
Were to take a grape variety like that and sort of work on it, maybe what we could do is actually solve some of the problems of having these grape varieties simply disappear because they're not very good. I remember asking Olmo about Carmenere, and he replied, Carmenere is the best grape variety for making claret-style wines. And he said, but the variety is just terrible. And I said, well, why don't you work on it? He said, work on it. I'm too old. So, again, that's one of the problems. Do we have anybody interested in doing a life's work sort of to salvage a grape variety? Any other questions? Good. That means you're either all astounded or bored out of your skulls. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darrell.